Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Today we look at a 24-year-old Derby man who was described during his trial as looking like the Milky Bar Kid and who has been found guilty of murder. John Williams plunged a vicious-looking hunting knife 3 times into the legs of Simon Jones during a robbery at Chaddensden Park. One of the wounds was so deep it severed a major artery in the 57-year-old's leg and he bled to death an hour later. Mr. Williams had been driven there by Jacob Ali under the orders of drug dealer Kirk Guy to rob a man called Carl Calladine of £7,000 worth of cocaine. But instead, with his face covered by a balaclava, he ended the life of Mr. Jones, a former RAF serviceman, father and grandfather. A jury of 7 men and 5 women cleared those 2 defendants of murder, but found them guilty of manslaughter. All 3 men, all from Chaddensden, were found guilty of a second count of conspiracy to commit robbery. All the verdicts were unanimous. It was an emotionally charged atmosphere in Courtroom 4 when the verdicts were delivered by the foreman. Mr. Guy and Mr. Williams had entered the dock, smiling at the packed public gallery full of family and friends. After the guilty verdicts had been delivered, Mr. Ali and Mr. Williams shook hands before the freshly convicted murderer blew a kiss to the public gallery. Mr. Guy looked stern-faced as he was led away, his grin now gone. His lordship, Mr. Justice Robin Knowles, who was to sentence the men, said, "You have been an exemplary jury, and I give you my thanks for the way you have carried out your public duty." Prosecutor Peter Joyce said, "Victim personal statements have been made by the son of Mr. Jones on behalf of the family, and by the partner of Mr. Jones, and they would like these read out at the sentencing hearing." The 7 men and 5 women took 4 days to reach their unanimous verdicts after hearing 4 weeks of evidence. Mr. Guy, 34, of Hayden Road, Mr. Williams of Waterford Drive, and Mr. Ali, 20, of Ashworth Avenue, all in Chaddensden, had denied the charges. Prosecutor Peter Joyce QC said Mr. Guy had arranged a drug deal with a friend of Mr. Jones, called Carl Calladine, which was scheduled to happen at the site of the killing on the evening of April 20th, 2019. He said Mr. Calladine and Mr. Jones drove into the latter's Volkswagen Transporter van to the car park at Chaddensden Park and arrived at 9:35 PM. Mr. Calladine was supposed to hand over cocaine to Mr. Williams and Mr. Ali, who had gone to meet him in a blue Renault Megane, which belonged to Mr. Guy, and be handed around £7,000 in cash in return. Mr. Joyce opened the case at the start of the trial said, "That was the belief of Carl Calladine. But in fact, no money was taken to the meeting by Mr. Ali and Mr. Williams, as they and Mr. Guy had agreed that Mr. Calladine and Mr. Jones were to be robbed of the drugs and done over as ordered by Mr. Guy with a knife or knives. The entire meeting was a setup arranged by Mr. Guy." At the park, Mr. Calladine went up to the Renault Megane and was robbed at knife point of 3 packs of cocaine, his phone and the keys to the transport van by Mr. Ali and Mr. Williams. Mr. Calladine managed to run away, but the Megane was moved closer to where the Volkswagen van was parked and Mr. Williams went over. Failing to get the rest of the drugs, there was supposed to be 10 packs in total, he attacked and stabbed Simon Jones. Mr. Joyce said, "The wound that killed him was around 6 centimeters deep, caused a particularly severe cut to an artery and was afflicted by this enormous knife. Mr. Jones suffered 3 stab wounds to the leg, 1 to the left and 2 to the right, one of which severed an artery, caused an internal bleed which proved fatal and which killed Simon Jones." Mr. Joyce said Mr. Jones also suffered an injury to his face, consistent to him being stuck, and 2 fractures to his ribs. He said he managed to get to the front door of a house in nearby Chaddensden Lane, where he was bleeding heavily, and a 999 call was made to the emergency services. But after being taken to the Royal Derby Hospital, and despite the best efforts of medics, he was pronounced dead at 10:40 PM that night. Mr. Joyce said the prosecution case is that it was Mr. Williams that actually stabbed Simon Jones, and that the others, Mr. Guy and Mr. Ali, either intended to assist him or intend to both rob him and cause him serious injury or to kill him in the course of the robbery. Mr. Guy set it up. Mr. Ali drove Mr. Williams to the scene, and Mr. Williams was the killer. After the stabbing, Mr. Williams' knife was then driven back to Mr. Ali's address, where it was cleaned in a bucket of bleach, wrapped and then hidden at an address in Alveston. 2 men, Ty Johnson, 20, of Renfrew Street, Chaddensden, and Zach Stevens, 27, of Courtroom Way, Alveston, have already pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of assisting an offender, admitting they cleaned and hid their weapon, and await sentencing. Mr. Calladine has already pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and will also be sentenced at a later date. Mr. Jones's family have previously described him as a true gentleman who was adored by everyone. All of the men are scheduled to be sentenced at Derby Crown Court. John Williams will spend a minimum of 25 years behind bars before being eligible to apply for parole for the murder of Simon Jones. The jury who found Mr. Williams guilty of murder found his accomplice Kirk Guy and Jacob Ali guilty of manslaughter. Mr. Guy and Mr. Ali were sentenced to 20 years and 8 years in prison respectively. So what are your thoughts about how this drug deal went bad, and on the instructions of drug dealer Kirk Guy to rob Carl Calladine of Class A drugs, and in the mix how 3 men took the life of Mr. Jones? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.